Do you remember when we all had a COVID encounter story? Do you remember those days where it was a big deal and we were all anxious that we had encountered somebody with COVID? We had a get-together at our house, families, kids. It was a regular COVID party. 90% of the people that came later reported having caught COVID. It was definitely the time frame. I'm neither confirming nor denying, but it was likely that it was Tracy's fault. We remember when we have these encounter stories. You probably have a lot of encounter stories. All you hunters, you have encounter stories. And you'll tell the story of whether you took the shot or didn't take the shot. The one that got away, the encounter that went south and didn't work out. You have relationship encounter stories. Encounter stories are important to us. They're the occasions where life changes and new things happen and bad things or good things occur, those encounter stories, and we remember them when they're significant. We remember those encounter stories, and all of us at some point in life have a God encounter story. And I want to talk today about this God encounter story that is turning up in your life. And in fact, if you have a heart to hear today, you have opportunity for a God encounter story. You have the opportunity to come face to face with the Lord and be able to walk away in doubt or walk ahead in faith. And each of us, every time we come to the text of God and we hear God speak again, it is an encounter occasion. And there's always a challenge of faith that comes with that, because those who follow Jesus aren't walking in good works, but in faith. And so it brings us, in our encounters with God, it brings us to what I'm going to call a faith trial. And let me give you a definition for what a faith trial is. A faith trial is anything that brings you to a decision to believe God by moving into the unknown with Him versus disbelieving God and moving forward on your own strength. So a faith trial, here it is, anything that brings you to a decision to believe God by moving into the unknown versus disbelieving God and moving forward on your own strength. So that's the path that we have before us. And when we encounter God, God is not someone who seems like us. God is someone who is totally other than us, and it's important for us to realize that this morning. Because God uses exceptional things to do a very different thing in your life. So you may have in your mind, I'm going to go do this direction, and I'm going to accomplish these things, and this is how life is going to unfold, and this is the plans that I'm making. And then God shows up in your life, and the big challenge is whether you say yes and follow Him, or whether you say, I think I got this in hand. That is the faith trial. So today we're going to learn how to win when we encounter the faith trial of life. How to win. Everybody wants to win. I did a little looking around on the internet, which is the encyclopedia of all things, only true things. And so I did a quick search looking for, is there a syndrome that has a name where people don't want to win? Like, not just hijack themselves or their team for their own causes and thus get their own win, but literally, are there people out there who are aiming to lose all the time? I don't mean people who end up losing all the time. That's different. But people who, through their decisions, are intentionally trying to lose. And I looked a long time. Some of you are like, I know some of those people. But you see, here's the thing. You can think you know some of those people, but are you looking to lose? Most of us are not. I couldn't find a single syndrome named for the desire, the actual desire to lose. Even suicide is an attempt to win in a really kind of flip side kind of way. And so I couldn't find anything in all of the wide world of the internet that even put a name on this kind of deal. All of us want to win somehow. It may be a really broken way of winning, but all of us are looking to gain something and to gain a win. And I'm just telling you today that in your faith, you can gain a win. And we're going to talk about how that happens. All right, so take your Bibles, turn to Exodus chapter 13. Chapter 13, we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We talked last week about the heritage of faith. See if this page will open. Yes, it will open. I was worried that Tracy got my Bible and glued those two pages together. We picked up last time, we had God telling Israel, here's what's going to happen when you come into the land, when you're settled, when you've escaped Egypt and got to the promised land. He set up the consecration of the firstborn and the feast of unleavened bread as instructional pieces so that heritage faith could be passed on to the next generation. We talked about how important that was. And now we get back to the main line of the narrative where Israel is literally marching out. And so we pick up in verse 17, chapter 13, verse 17. We're going to read a few of these verses together. Hang with me. We will cover all the way down to chapter 14, verse 14, and them about to walk into the Red Sea. And when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the sea of the wilderness toward the Red Sea, and the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. And they moved on from Sokah and encamped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. In front of Baal-zephon you shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. Lord, we ask for the guidance in your word this morning, that our hearts would be soft to hear, and our minds resolved to win through those faith trials, that we might walk with you in Jesus' name. Amen. So I want you to notice a few really critical things about our passage, because I would call these purpose cues. They are important phrases that the narrator tells us so that we understand what's important in the story. And so I want you to see verse 17. There is some concern in God's mind that Israel won't have faith to follow along. If you were to look at a map of northern Egypt, right along the Nile Delta, you would see a curve that rolls from moving to the east and rolls around north into modern Israel. The little strip right now that has an Egyptian wall facing Gaza is the route they could have followed, coming out of Egypt, going up through what is now called Gaza and into the Promised Land in that day. And that was a fairly short way. It was maybe 150 miles march, so not that far. But they don't go that way. They direct themselves, God directs them south because of these people called the Philistines. Now, God has just put the beat down on the world power of their day, the Egyptians. So why would God be concerned about confrontation with the Philistines? Well, this is the hint that the trial has turned from Pharaoh's belief to Israel's belief. There's a shift in the narrative that takes us down a new question. You see, we've been walking through from chapter 7. We've been walking through the hard-heartedness of Pharaoh. And the assumption is that Israel has the faith in their trial to follow the Lord. But they've been very passive. They have had no decisions to make. They just got to sit in the stands and eat popcorn while God thumped on Egypt. And I mean, listen, I want to tell you something. God will help you against enemies and against bad folks, all right? God will help you. But all of us get our turn with the encounter with God. And just like Egypt, Israel is going to find out that it had nothing to do with their birthright. It had everything to do with their faithfulness, because God was only pleased with faith. I want you to know that just because your parents had you in church growing up didn't make you a believer in Jesus. To trust Christ personally is what saves. Because you can't inherit faith. Every one of us has that encounter and has to come face to face with what we believe. And so you notice some really important things take shape in this passage. Notice their little journey. They go to the Red Sea. They're boxed in a little inlet, and so they're trapped between the sea, and then God actually has them turn around and face a certain direction. And Pharaoh to himself is supposed to say, and God has planned this, Pharaoh says to himself, the people are wandering in the desert. The wilderness has blocked them in. They don't know where they're going, but this is obviously untrue. And why is it untrue? You see in the text? Because they have a literal pillar of cloud and pillar of fire guiding them along their way. So if you're Israel, you say to yourself, should we have gone this way? And the answer is, yes, we're following that. Can you imagine following a tornado wherever it led you? It's pretty obvious. You ought to go that way, right? So you follow it. And at nighttime, guess what? It's on fire. Even better. You know the way to go. And that's the point. They know the way to go. And God has, catch this, God has led them to a trap. And I want to make an important first point here. God's leadership takes you into the trial. God's leadership takes you into the trial. And some of you are like, man, how do I get out of Satan's trap? And your problem is that you think it's Satan who has trapped you, instead of God being sovereign over even that. And the trial, the faith test being what has you trapped. God leads them to a place with no outlet, because God knows the hearts of these people, and He knows if they see war, they're going to hightail it back to Egypt. And God didn't do all that work just to see them return by the way they came. God suspects, I don't think God has to suspect anything, but we'll just use the human expression. God suspects that if they meet war, they will turn around. And so God literally traps them for His purposes. And not only that, but He commands how they are to camp. Notice in chapter 14, verse 4, you shall encamp facing it by the sea. Now, here's how I read this geography. One, those little phrases are unnecessary for us to get the general picture. And in most narrative, you're never going to have that little detail. So when you see that little detail, you need to perk up. This is, again, one of those cues that the author is giving us. You need to perk up and go, okay, why does it matter which way they're facing? So here's how I picture it. The sea is at their back and at their south. They have turned facing back toward Egypt because you know why? Because when Pharaoh's heart is hardened, they're going to be the first to see him come over the rise, bearing down on them in his chariots. And God tells them, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, so he's going to come after you. You won't be surprised when he shows up because you'll be looking that direction. You'll see his smoke trail, his dust trail long before you see him. And so you catch this whole very well orchestrated situation from God. They didn't get here by mistake, folks. And some of us, when we're in the heart of a trial, we need to take a breath and say, maybe God put me here. That is a very important distinction to make. You might have been broken and got in the trap. You might have been foolish and got in the trap. You may have been wandering on your own and got in the trap. And I want to tell you something. It doesn't matter how you got in the trap. The Lord is the rescue to get out of it. And He brings you to this faith trial so that you can win, not so that you lose. We understand this from a parenting standpoint. Some of you, maybe you pay for private school for your kids. And your kid's opinion on this is that you're paying for their torture. You could send them to the free school and not pay for their torture. From the standpoint of your kids, it's torture whether they're in the private school or whether they're in the free school. And it's just a matter of whether mom and dad extra dislike them and torture them, thus paying for it, or whether mom and dad just dislike them at the same level that all their friends' parents dislike those kids. Your kids don't necessarily understand the value of what you're doing for them, and so you put them in the trial, and sometimes you even pay for it. Listen, there's plenty of times when we pay for our own suffering. We go out and buy it, bring it home, and we pay for our suffering. And here it is that God has led them into this trial, and listen, here's what we find out. This trial is not the easy route. There was a faster, closer, quicker way to get to the end of the game, but God was interested in spiritual formation, not just in accomplishments. God is the one who trapped them between Pharaoh and the sea. They faced an opponent they could not defeat. I want you to notice something else. They marched out of Egypt with sword and armor. Did you catch that? And this is an interesting little drop in this, because in chapter 13, verse 18, and the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. You catch that? They're armed and ready. The men are soldiered and ready. They're not just a rabble marching out. They expect resistance. Now, what happens? God said, Pharaoh's going to come after you. He's parked them to sea. I imagine men to the front for battle, because that's how it would have worked. And verse 5 in chapter 14 picks up. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, what is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. And the Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea, at the same place where they were camped, waiting for Pharaoh. The threat is clear. They are small arms infantrymen versus tanks with a very determined opponent, a very well-organized military machine bearing down on them. You see, when you come into the trial, I just want to remind you that the trial tests your heart condition, not your ability. The trial tests your heart condition, not your ability. If you've ever done an interview, you interview because there's a couple of things the potential employer wants to know about. Number one, your skills to do the job, your competency, and some of those things. And I'm convinced after doing interviews and different things like that you do as much as you can to find out everything you could about a prospective employee, and then you roll the dice because they're just things you don't know. But you interview to learn skills, to learn competency, to learn experience. And so you're trying to ask the right questions to get to the bottom of it. But there's always that portion at the bottom of the resume, or that's provided later, that is your references. Why have references? I mean, if you ask somebody's parents how good they are, that's probably a good indicator if they'll be honest with you about these features that you don't know about. So you get references. References are about the goodness of the person. They could be really skillful, and you call their references, and the reference is like, that guy is great at what he does, but he's a total jerk. Interview for skills, reference for goodness. We want some kind of character connection. We want to understand how that person is. And listen, I want you to know that when God is putting you on the trial, when you're encountering God, He's not concerned with whether you can do or not do. He's concerned with who you are and who you're not. He's concerned with His image, His likeness, the likeness of Christ being implanted and growing within so that you become more like His likeness. Now, if you're Israel, you're in the trap. Look at verse 10, what happens, chapter 14, verse 10. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes. Yeah, that's all they had to do. They didn't even have to crane their neck. And behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. I told you the narrative shift, right? We were testing Pharaoh's faith before. Pharaoh never overcame his hard heart. Never. And now Israel is the one being tested. God has said exactly all that's going to happen. He said, you're going to see them pretty soon. They're going to come over the rise, right? They're coming for you. I even faced you to look at them. There's the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And they say to Moses in verse 11, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. You catch that? Now listen. If you've ever been in the trap of life, it's a despairing place. But if you're Israel, this is almost incomprehensible, because I want you to just zoom out. Let's get on their battlefield view for just a moment. All right, let's think about this. What do they know? Well, there are evidences of God's leadership that existed everywhere. They had a recent history of God's actions. Remember the 10 plagues culminating in the Passover. They know that God is working directly for them. There's no question about this. They just know God's hand is with them. So they have a history of God working on their behalf. They could just look up and look, there's a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night so that they can wash their sandals at dark, and it's not a big deal. They've got light, they've got warmth, they've got shade, they've got coolness. Whatever the situation is, it's obvious God's manifest presence is right there with them. And so if they're assessing their battlefield odds, they're like, well, God has beat up on these guys before. God is currently here with us. And then they have this other thing. I don't know if you caught it. Did you catch the Joseph's bones comment earlier? Why does that matter? Well, because 430 years earlier, when Joseph had taken his family down into Egypt, when all of this saga at the end of Genesis began, he said, make sure when God takes you to the promised land that you take up my bones from here, relocate them into the sacred land that God will take you to. So they have prophetic direction. God has given them recent history, strong action that He showed them. He's given them His manifest presence through the pillar of cloud and fire, and He's given them a prophetic evidence that they're going toward victory. I've seen churches and people who have walked away from following the Lord when His evidence of work was highest. And here they are. They just lose it. They neglect all the promise that God ever made in their despair. You know what I think is impacting some of this for them? It's because they are in a helpless situation. Pharaoh's army was superior. But you know what I think confuses them? And I think it confuses us? They had some ability. They marched out equipped for battle. Remember that? They march out equipped for battle, but they know that their armaments are inferior to anything that Pharaoh has. So they feel some ready. They have some provision. They have some capability, but it's not near enough for the occasion. You ever been in that situation? You've got some of your budget matched, but it's not near enough. You know, as a church, we have some of what we need matched by the Lord, but it's not near enough. And Tracy and I have been talking about, we kind of feel like we are in a quiet revival as God moves in the hearts of people and brings real transformation. And you know what the anxiety always is? It's like, yeah, but we don't have enough money to continue doing the things that we're doing. So, yeah, we've got some provision, but not enough provision. And you know what the substance of despair often is? It's feeling like you should have enough because you at least have a little. Listen, I think they would have felt better about this whole situation if they had no armaments and they were 100% dependent on God. They allowed themselves to think for a moment that they could have ever done this on their own. You look at their situation, they're certainly trapped. They seem to be wandering, other than, the pillar. And God seemed nowhere in particular other than that pillar. And so they look around, they see the evidence of God's leadership, and instead they grab hold of their own inability and they despair over that. Listen, this is a message about us. In the faith trial, here's what's guaranteed. You will not have enough. You will not be sufficient. You will not be able to rise to the level you need to rise to. In that broken relationship, in that broken family situation, you're going to be totally incapable of putting some things back together. And you're going to be tempted to do what they did. You're going to throw up your hands and say, listen, was it like they didn't have enough graves in Egypt, so you just wanted to bring us out here for extra space? You ever driven by an old cemetery? You wonder where they put all the new bodies? You wonder if eventually they're going to run out of space to put bodies. Do you ever think about this? Mathematics? And then you're glad for people that get buried at sea because they're making room for the rest of us someday. Is that macabre? Terrible thing to say. Some of you are uncertain whether that's a joke or not. You're telling me you've never driven by a graveyard and we're like, man, where are they going to put new people? It looks pretty packed in there. This is what they're saying. So our graveyard's full. And so you, Moses, you see they've already forgot who was leading them. You, Moses, brought us out here to die. Didn't we tell you, don't even start this journey? Oh, that's funny. You were celebrating like a day ago, and now you're totally defeated because you marched out and you're like, we can handle this now. God got us here. We can handle this. And now you're pinned up against the sea, and you're not sure that you could ever have made this decision. You've come to the faith trial. Everything seems lost. And even though all the evidence surrounds them that God is at work, nonetheless, there's this stirring, and they complain against Moses. Now let's finish these verses, verse 13 and chapter 14. And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again." Now catch his advice. "The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." You can see all the men, hands on their swords, girding up for a hopeless battle. And Moses says, "Stand down, just keep your mouth shut." Here's the trick to winning at the faith trial. We win when we know how to keep quiet and move forward. That's what happens. That's how you win the faith trial. It's not always going to make sense how you make it. Like, you'll look back and be like, "Man, I don't know how we made it." I've got some young years of our finances, and I look back and I'm like, I don't know how we made it. But I guess, since I'm on a diet, it wasn't for lack of eating. We apparently had enough calories, and that was all right. How did we make it? But we made it. I look at the history of our church, and sometimes I'm like, how did we make it? And yet we did. The evidence is all around us of what God is doing, if we're paying attention to his leadership. But so often, because we don't have enough, we throw up our hands and we just say it's never going to happen. So we win when we know how to keep quiet and move forward. Here's what losing is like. Losing is dependence on you and your abilities in matters of spiritual things. All right, here's the justification that happens in our heart. We justify, because of our current situation and the faith trial we're in, we justify ignoring the historic power of God that's been on display. I want to tell you something. If you've ever had a moment where you have turned to Christ or sensed Christ's calling or had God's deliverance, I don't mean your money just automatically was great or anything like that. I mean, in your heart, you've experienced a sensation from God that he was calling and tugging at you. If you've ever had that, then you have come in contact with God in that moment. And you cannot forget that God has a critically important plan for your life, and he is designed for your salvation. And today could be that day. And we lose by justifying our ignoring of God's strong hand in our life. We lose by justifying that feeling of, yeah, but it's not enough. It's something, but it's not enough. I just don't have faith to follow God. God just needs to show up. Would it be so hard just for God to do something and get me out of this bind? That's that it's not enough feeling. And we justify that we're right for having that. And so since God won't do it, let's do it on our own. Let's pick up our own pieces and live out our own life. Losing is justifying that complaining and despairing is reasonable. You know why I hate church budget time? Because complaining and despairing becomes reasonable. There have been times when we thought, we going down. We thought that. We felt that. We've experienced that. I've had seasons of anxiety, and yet all the time, seeing God move in ways that only God could move. We were in the trap, faced between the direction of God and the sea and the enemies attacking. We felt that pressure. And there were some times where I felt justified in my complaining and despair in those moments because it was, from a human standpoint, absolutely reasonable. And yet, I want to tell you, here we are. Because winning depends on Christ and his ability. Losing depends on you and your ability. You see, you weren't called into a walk of faith with Jesus so that you could cross the Red Sea on your own. You didn't know the challenges you would face. You were called into following Jesus so that you could win this faith trial. And so winning, listen, allows encouragement. You ever been frustrated that somebody was trying to encourage you? You're like, let me wallow. I need a pity party for now. And you're coming in with your party-breaking encouragements. Leave me alone. I just want to be sad and upset and despair about it for a moment. You ever had a pity party? That's exactly what it is. You don't want somebody all cheery, just like Julie comes in the office all cheery. I'm like, Julie, get out of my office for now. I want to sulk about this. Glad she's got her own office. Comes in all chipper. Go on down the hall. Leave me alone. You notice I'm only telling a Julie story because she's now in here, so she gets to hear them. It's not behind your back, gal. Well, it's why you're not preaching. Winning stands firm in that trial. Winning stands firm in the trial. It receives encouragement, so all the things on the battlefield, they would have looked up and they would have seen this is exactly God's plan and found encouragement that God was with them. That matters, right? They would have stood firm in that trial. All they had to do, Moses' instruction is stand down and just hang tight. Keep your mouth shut. God's about to do something. Do you remember the 3D wave of movies that came out? Do you remember that? There was a whole series of 3D movies. Everything started being in 3D. And you go to the theater and you get those dumb glasses, and you're supposed to sit there for 2 hours with the 3D vertigo stuff going on. I'm glad they abandoned that because I was sick and tired of movies all of them being in 3D and then wanting to go in those dumb glasses and sit there like a doofus for 2 hours. Some of you are feeling offended because you liked that era of movie making. And in those occasions, all you had to do to stand firm in the face of whatever was going on the screen was shut your eyes, right? You just had to close your eyes, and then other than the noise and all of that, you didn't have to experience the 3D effect of whatever it was going on. Well, these guys got to stay there, but in one sense, that's not dissimilar from the occasion. They're getting a front row, intimidating view, but they're not really in this battle. They're not really fighting. They're still spectators to what God is doing. They've owned the responsibility. They've got their hands on their swords. They think they're about to have to walk out there and get slaughtered. But in fact, they're still spectators. That's why God was like, hey, listen, front stage, you want to turn that way because you need to see this happen. Because they're still spectators. And I want you to remember that when God is leading, some spectacular transformation can take place in your life, and you're going to have to do some walking as that occurs. But walking with Christ is not despairing over every little bump you come to. Winning requires a trust in God's character. God was already concerned. He didn't really trust their character, and He was right to do so. But winning in the faith trial means trusting in God's character. This is perhaps the hardest faith that we offer. Because we think sometimes when we've done boneheaded things, when we're sitting in the seat of the fool because of foolish things that we've done, that somehow God's like, you know what? I'm going to step off and let you experience all of that and let us go. And the reason we think that is because that's what we would have done. That's what we felt like doing. But God doesn't do that. Some of you, you've got prodigals, prodigal children. Some of you know that you've got a prodigal in the making. It's just a matter of time. And you're wondering how to deal with that. And I tell you, you can trust in the character of God to both hear your prayers and to work in their lives. I say often that I was never certain of my dad's salvation, but I saw God's hand in his life repeatedly, either because of our prayers for his salvation or because of God's discipline in his life. Either way, there was always a callback. And my confidence in God's character grew because of what I saw him do faithfully in my father's life as he worked on him. Folks, I just want to tell you, God works on us, and he works on your people, and he calls us out through hard things and easy things. And notice, God doesn't say, you know what, you complainy little rear ends, I'm just going to let you go back to Egypt. They came out to get you, so fine, go back. You notice that? God grabs hold of that situation, and he is determined that if anybody disciplines his children, it's going to be him, not the Egyptians. That's in God's character. And then here's the fourth thing for winning, and then we're going to wrap this up. When you're in the trial, it's better to keep silent instead of complaining. You see, what they do is challenge God's goodness. You know what I think is a fundamental part of our life and our faith is this belief that God is a good God, that he is for us and not against us, and that his ways, no matter how difficult and hard they are, that his ways are good things for us. And so sometimes you got to bite your tongue. You want to complain, you want to argue, you want to throw a fit, and you need to keep your mouth shut and just watch for God's next move. Some of us are way ahead of what we think God's going to do to get us out of the problem that we're having. And we can't even imagine the ways that God would move. Nobody, and I'm pretty convinced, not even Moses, was standing watching Pharaoh come in and was thinking, you know, I bet what God could do is just make the Red Sea part and we could go through. That's a good idea. Let's pray for that. They didn't even know what to pray for. And folks, I want you to know some of the deliverance that God's going to bring in those broken relationships and in your broken family and all of that, some of the regret you're feeling, you're like, man, I messed these kids up. Or some of the resentment you're feeling, you're like, my parents messed me up. I want to tell you something. You can't imagine all that God can do and will do. And he calls you to have an obedient, soft heart, because to get on his page is to see at a different level altogether. And God does some things that nobody could have seen coming. Maybe you can't imagine a day without an appetite for alcohol. And God can remove that. He doesn't always remove that, but he can remove that. God can turn life around, and he can do it quickly. So how do you know that you succeeded in the faith trial? Well, I want to tell you something. You're here this morning. And this wasn't Satan's plan for your life. Satan didn't have planned for you to sit in the company of truth and the word. Satan had something else planned for you today, but it wasn't this. And I just want to tell you that you know that you're accomplishing and you're winning at the faith trial in the small ways in which this life is happening right now. You're here and you have an invitation to trust the Lord in faith and to begin a life and a following after him. That invitation might look like the Red Sea. You know, there are plenty of us that think that walking into a church will make the roof collapse. I tell you, that is yet to happen by anybody. And I've seen some folks that don't belong in church come in. But I just remind you today that you're here and your being here is not accidental. God has a plan for your life. And God can redeem the brokenness. And God will make that way. Will you stand with me? We're going to pray, and then the team's going to come back.